Last week we talked about negative space, and this week it's all about isolation. But in this case, isolation equals innovation. Hi, I'm Ardith, and today I'll show you how I used one new wreath stencil from Penguin Palace Stamp's latest release and increasing isolation design techniques to get 5 very different looking cards. First, let's take a look at the stencil itself. This is one of a number of new round stencils that Penguin Palace Stamps has released this week for use with the Stencils 360 tool. And it's the latest in their collection of wreath stencils, which allow you to build a multicolored wreath without any masking. Here's the result of this new stencil when you blend ink through all the holes. It fills an 8-inch square panel with these gorgeous arts and crafts type roses and leaves and some swirls as well as rosebuds right in the center. You can use this in any number of ways. I made a 1-layer slimline card with the whole panel. I added a window to the front and color on the inside for something different. Let's start with just a little isolation to create a more open wreath design by leaving out those rosebuds. I put my stencil back into the stencil guide, and you can see I still have all the ink from the first panel on the stencil, and actually I find it helps me remember where I want each color. I lined up the double circle hole on the edge of the stencil with the 12 o'clock marking on the base of the tool. That double circle hole means that each time you turn the stencil, you want to move it by 60 degrees to get the correct spacing of all the elements, so they line up to create that wreath look that I just showed you. If you want to see more about the basics of how this tool works, I've linked my playlist above and in the description below. This time I'm filling in the rose and the leaves, but not the rosebuds or dots in the center. And this time, even though the leaves and swirls will be the same color in each turn, I'm changing the color of the rose each time to create a rainbow wreath. So after I've finished inking in all the areas in each rotation, I'm actually taking my stencil away and cleaning off the ink just around the rose so my next rose won't be contaminated. I continue working my way around until I have all 6 rotations done, and when I lift up the stencil, I have a lovely spring wreath of roses. And here's the original full wreath, and you can see the difference in the openness in the center. I cut this one down to make an A2 card with part of the wreath and another friendly sentiment. But what if I take the isolation one step further? This time, instead of leaving out only one element, I'm going to ink blend only through one set of the leaves and see what I'll get. I looked at the stencil and figured out which leaves I needed to get that center ring of leaves. I taped off the other elements that were close by so I won't get ink in any areas that I don't want it. And this time, instead of turning it 60 degrees each time, I'm going to do 15 degrees. This will give me a much fuller little wreath. After a couple of turns, I see that I'm getting some overlap, so I think I'm going to get a really neat layered look. To blend the ink into these little holes, I'm using an iCrafter brush dauber. I prefer using brushes on stencils since sponge blenders can get damaged by the stencil edges, but you can use whatever you have. This time when I remove the stencil, I have a lush leafy wreath that would be perfect for Christmas or for a tropical or jungle theme. I used it with a large sentiment and some little flower sequins for a fresh spring design, perfect to send to a friend. Let's get a little more drastic now. This time I want to isolate one of the whole rose patterns. I want it in a particular spot on my card panel, so I made sure that I placed the panel carefully on my grid work surface so the rose will be where I want it. Then I blended ink through only the rose area. I turned the stencil 60 degrees and I can see that the leaves are now lined up under the rose, so that's the area for ink blending this time. I used gray for these leaves and then I turned another 60 degrees and blended the gray ink through the stem portions. I did another 60-degree turn and there's another set of leaves and that's it. I didn't do that final turn because that had the rosebud and all the little dots, and I don't think I need them for this. I finished this one simply by adding a gray frame and a thanks sentiment. Next, I'm going to combine the isolation technique with 2 ideas I had for using these round stencils without the tool. The first one uses a simple corner added to the stencil. I've used post-it tape to attach a square piece of cardstock to the stencil, making sure that I'm not covering up the rose, which is what I want to use for this card. Having this corner allows me to line up the stencil using the grid marks on my work surface, and it'll give me precise placement as I move it along to create a row of perfectly spaced roses. When I have the first one fully blended, I just move the stencil along to the right, using the grid to count out how far along I want it. You could move it up or down as well if you wanted a different look. One thing I noticed as I moved along is that I need to be careful not to blend over the round edge of the stencil, and using these smaller blending brushes really helped me to focus the ink where I wanted it. And finally, of course, you can just freehand the parts of the stencil you want to use by placing it down where you want it and blending your ink through, as I did here with the leaves. So many looks with one stencil just by isolating the design more and more. If you're a crafter who likes getting more from your crafty supplies, I've created a whole playlist just for you. Start with this video and I'll meet you there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.